London, mid-1960s. The press hall is packed wall to wall, cigarette smoke curling upward as cameras flash like lightning. For weeks, the newspapers have whispered the same story. Elvis Presley may be the king of rock and roll, but he's poorly educated, unfit to inspire the youth. The room crackles with anticipation, waiting for someone bold enough to say it aloud. A journalist rises, young, confident, smirking. His voice cuts through the noise. "Mr. Presley, don't you think that with your level of education, you're not exactly the right figure to be an icon for young people?" The question hangs in the air, cruel and deliberate. Laughter erupts, not only from the reporter's colleagues, but from scattered corners of the room, sharp and dismissive. It's the kind of laughter Elvis has heard since boyhood, the kind that once made him lower his head and stay quiet. But not this time. Elvis lifts his gaze. His eyes are steady, cold with resolve. The laughter fades as quickly as it began, strangled by the silence that follows. Dozens of cameras point at him, eager to capture either a stumble or an outburst. Instead, his voice emerges. Calm, unhurried, but carrying a weight that makes the entire hall lean in. And in that moment, with just a few unexpected words, Elvis Presley begins to rewrite not only his own story, but the way the world will remember him. Let us know where you're watching from, and we hope you enjoy the story. The summer heat in Tupelo, Mississippi during the 1930s was not just hot. It pressed against the skin like a weight. In a small, weathered wooden house on Old Saltillo Road, Vernon and Gladys Presley tried to raise their only surviving son. The house had just 2 rooms, floors that creaked at every step, and walls so thin that the sound of a neighbor's radio could drift straight through at night. Poverty was not a word the Presleys used. It was simply the air they breathed. Vernon struggled to find work wherever he could, mostly hauling or farming, and often came home with little more than promises of pay. Gladys stretched every penny, sewing clothes, trading favors with neighbors, keeping her boy fed when meat was a rare luxury. For young Elvis, life was small but full of observation. He noticed the way his mother whispered prayers over him at night, asking for strength, asking for protection. He noticed the way his father's shoulders stooped after a day's labor. And most of all, he noticed the quiet music of Tupelo itself. The blues spilling from black churches on Sunday mornings. The gospel harmonies rising from gatherings at night. Those sounds cut through the grayness of poverty and gave the boy something to cling to. By the time the Presleys packed up and left Tupelo for Memphis in 1948, Elvis was 13 and still shy, still unsure of his place in the world. They arrived with little more than a truckload of belongings and dreams for something better. Memphis was louder, faster, and far less forgiving. The Presleys settled in a housing project not far from downtown, surrounded by other families trying to climb out of the same pit of need. At Humes High School, Elvis stood out for the wrong reasons. His accent, thick with the drawl of Mississippi, made him sound unpolished compared to classmates who mocked him as a country boy. His clothes, often hand-me-downs, never seemed to fit quite right. The children of store owners, clerks, and teachers walked with an air of confidence. Elvis walked with his head low, hoping to pass unnoticed. He was never without kindness, never without a "yes, ma'am" or "no, sir." But that didn't shield him from the sting of laughter when he stumbled over a word in class or hesitated during recitations. Still, somewhere in that uncertain boy lived a hidden current of courage. His music teacher caught a glimpse of it. One day, after weeks of hearing Elvis hum to himself in the back of class, the teacher asked him to sing aloud. The room erupted in laughter before he even opened his mouth. Elvis flushed red, looked down at his worn shoes, and almost refused. But something inside pushed him forward. He sang a gospel tune, soft at first, then steady. By the end of the first verse, the room had gone silent. That silence, heavy and unexpected, burned itself into his memory. For the first time, Elvis felt the power of his own voice not just as sound, but as a way of silencing ridicule. Graduating in 1953 with nothing more than a high school diploma, Elvis stood at the edge of a society that valued college degrees as passports into respectability. In post-war America, education was the new ladder to middle-class life. Veterans returned from service to flood into universities, while their children dreamed of doctorates and careers in polished offices. For Elvis, that world was out of reach. His family had no money for further schooling, and the idea of college seemed as far-fetched as traveling to another planet. He carried his diploma proudly, but to many around him, it was a reminder of limitation rather than achievement. It was in this gap, between what society demanded and what Elvis could offer, that his artistry began to grow. By day, he worked odd jobs, as a movie theater usher, a truck driver, anything that kept money coming in. By night, he lingered near the edges of Beale Street, absorbing the rhythms of blues and the freedom of voices that sang without permission. He bought cheap records, listened until the grooves wore thin, and imitated the sounds until they became his own. When his chance finally came, a recording at Sun Studio in 1954, Elvis walked in carrying all the doubts of those years. The laughter of classmates, the weight of being just a poor boy, the sting of being called a hillbilly. His first songs began to ripple across Memphis, and then beyond. Crowds appeared, hungry for the sound that was unlike anything else. But as his music drew attention, so did the questions. Journalists, in their crisp suits and polished shoes, circled him like vultures. They loved to remind him, and the public, that he was a truck driver who barely finished high school. One reporter, in a small but widely read interview, sneered directly into his face. "A boy with that accent will never represent America." Elvis smiled politely, but inside, the wound cut deep. Ironically, the very thing they mocked, his accent, his manner, his humble roots, became the reason ordinary people loved him. He wasn't a college-educated son of privilege. He was one of them. His simple, "Yes, sir," and "Thank you, ma'am," rang more honest than the rehearsed eloquence of polished celebrities. Fans wrote letters saying they felt he understood their lives, their struggles, and every article that tried to paint him as too common only fueled the devotion of those who saw themselves in him. Still, beneath the growing fame, that vulnerability lingered. Elvis knew that his background would always be a target. He carried the weight of being the boy from Tupelo, and with each stage he stepped onto, he also stepped into the arena of scrutiny. The louder the cheers, the sharper the knives of the press waiting backstage. It was here, in this tension, that the central conflict of his life began to take shape. The constant reminder that, no matter how brightly he shone on stage, some would always look down on him for where he came from and how little formal schooling he had. The story of Elvis Presley, the man who rose from a two-room shack to global fame, would forever carry this shadow. The question of whether a poor boy with a Southern accent could ever be accepted as more than a spectacle. And though Elvis never forgot the warmth of those first cheers in his high school classroom, he also never forgot the smirk of the journalist who told him he would never be a symbol. That memory would return again and again until the moment he finally found his chance to answer. By the late 1950s, the boy who once shrank from ridicule at Hume's High had become a phenomenon. His name was on record charts, his face on billboards, his movements copied in front of mirrors by teenagers across America. Yet with every step upward, the press seemed determined to drag him back down. Journalists no longer mocked just his accent or his lack of polish. They now had a new angle: education. In the post-war boom, college enrollment was soaring. The nation celebrated engineers, scientists, and polished young men in suits. Against that backdrop, Elvis, with his truck-driving past and high school diploma, was painted as an outsider, a symbol of low culture infiltrating the mainstream. After serving in the Army from 1958 to 1960, Elvis returned home with the maturity that came from 2 years of discipline and duty. He had marched, taken orders, and carried himself as a soldier. Fans greeted him as a hero. The press, however, sharpened their knives in a new way. The very first interviews after his return carried barbed questions. "Now that you're back, Mr. Presley, do you think you'll ever take classes to polish yourself?" Another article, printed in a national magazine, described him as a hillbilly in a shiny uniform, claiming that no amount of Army service could erase the fact that he never went further than a classroom in Memphis. Elvis, in those moments, kept his composure. He answered politely, even when it stung. He told one interviewer, "I'm just glad to be home, sir. I'll keep doing what I do best." But behind the smile, he carried the sting of being measured not by his music, not by his service, but by the lack of a degree. One evening, backstage after a performance, a friend handed him a folded newspaper. The headline blared, "Presley, the illiterate king of rock and roll." The article sneered that his answers in interviews were too rehearsed to be his own, implying that someone else fed him lines, because a boy from the projects couldn't possibly think that way. Elvis read it silently, his jaw tightening. The room buzzed with laughter from his entourage, but he stayed quiet, staring at the words until the paper crumpled in his hand. After a long silence, he said only, "I don't have to answer with words. I'll answer with music." That vow shaped his private life in ways few knew. Behind closed doors, Elvis began to read, truly read. His library at Graceland grew steadily. Bibles, history texts, volumes of poetry, books on philosophy and mysticism. He pored over them late at night, sometimes underlining passages, sometimes copying lines into notebooks. He wasn't studying for grades or prestige. He was feeding something deeper, a hunger to prove to himself that he was more than the caricature painted in headlines. Friends began to notice. In quiet conversations, he would quote a passage from Marcus Aurelius, or recite a verse from Scripture that matched the mood of the evening. He did not flaunt it, never threw it into interviews, but those closest to him saw that his mind was not the empty vessel critics imagined. Still, whispers in the media spread. Rumors claimed his answers in press conferences were scripted by handlers, that someone with his background couldn't possibly form a thoughtful sentence. The irony was cruel. When he was shy and spoke little, he was branded ignorant. When he offered insight, he was accused of faking it. The conflict became two-sided. On one end, the journalists who needed to sell papers painted him as white trash made famous. On the other, Elvis quietly carved out his own path of learning, building a private education not in lecture halls, but in solitude, night after night, with the weight of books in his hands. It wasn't only the press. Even within Hollywood, some directors whispered doubts. During the filming of his movies in the early 1960s, a few screenwriters joked that Presley wouldn't understand complex dialogue. One assistant director, thinking Elvis couldn't hear, muttered, Stick to singing, boy. You're not here to think Elvis never confronted them. At least, not then. He simply delivered his lines, smiled for the cameras, and went home to open another book. Yet the doubts gnawed at him. In Memphis, on nights when he gathered with the Memphis Mafia, he sometimes turned serious. The laughter would die down when Elvis, holding a book in his lap, spoke quietly. "They think I'm stupid. But I'll tell you, there's more to knowing than what they teach in schools." To his friends, these moments revealed the tension inside him. A man adored by millions, yet haunted by the suspicion that the world's gatekeepers would never see him as equal. By the early 1960s, the press began circling with sharper questions. Articles labeled him the king of vulgarity, a puppet of fame, or worse, a danger to youth. Education became the tool to discredit him further. If he quoted scripture, they mocked his accent. If he stayed silent, they accused him of ignorance. Every move was ammunition. But Elvis carried a quiet strategy. He refused to lash out. He kept his dignity in public, letting the insults hang in the air, knowing one day he would find the moment to answer. Not with anger, but with strength. Behind the glimmer of stardom, the press war had begun. The stage lights shone brighter. The music reached higher. But just beyond the applause, a battle was brewing. Between a man who had carved his life out of poverty and a media machine that refused to let him forget where he came from. And though Elvis kept repeating, "I'll answer with my music," a deeper truth was forming. He would not only answer with songs, he was preparing, without even knowing it, for the day he would stand before the cameras, mocked to his face, and deliver words that the world would never forget. Las Vegas, early 1970s. The International Hotel glittered against the desert night, its towering facade promising glamour and triumph. Inside, the air buzzed with energy. Elvis Presley had just finished one of his powerhouse shows, the kind where the crowd screamed until their throats were raw, the kind where scarves tossed into the audience felt like sacred relics. Sweat still clung to his skin as he slipped into a tailored jacket, preparing to face a different kind of stage, the press conference. Reporters were already gathered, their notebooks ready, cameras flashing, cigarette smoke curling upward into the chandelier-lit room. This was not applause. This was scrutiny, sharpened into questions that could wound as deeply as any blade. Elvis knew it, and he felt it in the pit of his stomach. He took his seat at the table, microphones crowding in front of him. The first few questions were predictable, about the show, his fans, his schedule. He answered politely, his voice calm, his humor disarming. Then, from the back of the room, a journalist stood. His tone carried mockery even before the words formed. "Mr. Presley," he began, leaning into the microphone, "do you ever regret not going to college? Or do you still just read comic books?" A ripple of laughter moved through the room. Some chuckles were nervous, others openly cruel. A few reporters looked down at their notepads, ashamed, but the man kept grinning, satisfied with his provocation. The sound of laughter stabbed deeper than any insult. For a moment, Elvis lowered his gaze. He let the silence stretch, his hands folded, the laughter echoing against the walls until it died awkwardly. Cameras clicked, eager to capture the hesitation, to freeze the image of a king cornered. Then he lifted his head. The grin at the corners of his mouth was not one of humor, but of resolve. His voice, when it came, was low, deliberate, steady. "I read," he said, pausing long enough to force every ear to lean in. "And I remember." The room shifted. The mocking journalist straightened slightly, unsure now of his footing. Elvis continued, quoting lines from a book he had read the night before. Not from a comic, not from a cheap magazine, but from a volume of spiritual writing. The words rolled out of him with quiet authority, not showy, but grounded. It was the kind of answer no scriptwriter could have prepared, a line too precise in its depth to be staged. The silence that followed was heavier than the laughter had been. Cameras kept flashing, but the atmosphere had turned. What was meant to humiliate him had instead opened a window into a different Presley, one few in that room had ever considered. He finished with a sentence that seemed to hang in the air long after he spoke it. My education is my people, my experience, my music. You can keep your bookshelves and your jokes. We'll see which of us the world remembers. The blow was not shouted, not angry, but delivered with such calm certainty that it struck harder than fury ever could. The journalist who had mocked him shuffled in his seat. Around him, the room remained silent for a beat too long before the next question stumbled forward. But the energy had shifted. The press had expected amusement at his expense. Instead, they had been given a performance as sharp and unforgettable as anything he did on stage. Backstage later, one of his friends said, "Man, you shut him down cold." Elvis only shook his head. "I don't want to shut anybody down. I just want them to know I'm not what they think." That night, the newspapers went to press. By morning, the headlines carried words no one had predicted. Presley turns the tables on the press. Another paper ran, "The King's sharpest reply yet." Yet the coverage was not unanimous. Some columnists praised him, calling his response surprisingly profound. Others sneered that he had rehearsed it, that the quote was memorized, that a singer with a high school diploma could never speak like that on his own. But whether in praise or ridicule, the world was talking. Fans noticed, too. Thousands of letters poured in, thanking him for standing tall against the sneers. "You spoke for us," one woman wrote, "for all of us who never had a chance to go to college, but know we're not stupid." Another wrote simply, "Thank you for showing them dignity." In one of the tabloids, buried beneath sensational photographs, a critic admitted grudgingly, "Perhaps Presley has more substance than we've given him credit for." It was not a full concession, but it was a crack in the wall. Elvis read only a few of the articles. He did not dwell on them, though the sting of the question lingered. He spent the following evening alone in his suite, quietly turning the pages of a worn Bible, reflecting on the exchange. He had not planned his answer. It had come from instinct, from years of being underestimated, from the weight of carrying other people's laughter. To the public, it was a single moment, a clever comeback, a headline-grabbing quote. To Elvis, it was something deeper, proof that he could stand in the arena of intellect, not just in the arena of music. For the first time, he had spoken back, not with a guitar, not with a song, but with words that carried the force of his conviction. And though the applause from the press room could never compare to the roar of a concert crowd, it was perhaps the most important silence of his career. The silence after laughter had died, when every ear had turned to him, and he had answered not as a boy from Tupelo, not as a mocked hillbilly, but as Elvis Presley, a man who refused to be diminished. What he did not yet know was that this would not be the last time the press tested him. They would come again, sharper, louder, determined to break him. But now, the world had seen what happened when Elvis Presley chose to answer, and that memory would make the next confrontation even more explosive. The morning after the Las Vegas press conference, hotel lobbies, airport kiosks, and corner stands carried headlines that seemed to pulse with shock. Black ink screamed from every page. Presley silences critics with stunning reply. Another read, "The King speaks, and the world listens." It was rare for a performer to dominate front pages, not with scandal, but with words. Yet, that was what happened. Televised talk shows replayed grainy clips of Elvis's steady voice, his calm dismantling of the insult, over and over. Some anchors leaned forward in awe, calling him unexpectedly wise. Others smirked, suggesting it was all theater. But whether with admiration or cynicism, they could not stop discussing it. Fan mail at Graceland multiplied overnight. Bags of letters arrived, thousands at a time, filled with stories from people who felt overlooked in their own lives. A factory worker from Ohio wrote, "They laughed at you like they laugh at me when I speak at union meetings. Thank you for showing them we're not fools." A mother from Texas wrote, "My son left school at 16 to help feed the family. When you answered them, you answered for him too." Inside his Memphis home, Elvis sat with Priscilla at the breakfast table, a newspaper spread before them. She read the words aloud, shaking her head in disbelief. "You don't realize what you did," she told him softly. "You gave a voice to everyone they've ever looked down on." Elvis only shrugged, reaching for his coffee. He wasn't chasing heroism. He had only defended himself. But her words lingered, a reminder that his fight with the press was larger than personal pride. The reaction abroad was even stranger. In Europe, cartoonists sketched him in caps and gowns, holding a diploma in one hand and a guitar in the other. The images were meant to mock, but they backfired, drawing attention to the absurdity of the criticism. In Germany, where he had once been stationed, papers called him a soldier who returned with more than a uniform, he returned with dignity. In France, a cultural critic wrote, "If intelligence is measured only in classrooms, then we have misunderstood genius altogether." And then came the unexpected twist, from Memphis itself. An elderly man, retired now but once a teacher at Hume's High, published an open letter in the local newspaper. He recalled Elvis as a quiet student who often sat in the back row but listened intently, eyes fixed on the lesson. He was never the loudest voice, never the one with polished grammar. But I saw in him a depth of curiosity, a hunger to understand. We must not confuse humility with ignorance. That letter struck a chord. It was reprinted in national outlets, reminding readers that beneath the star's glitter was still the boy from Memphis, carrying scars of ridicule but also the dignity of persistence. Yet not everyone surrendered. Prominent columnists doubled down, accusing Elvis of staging the entire exchange. One magazine claimed, "His handlers planted that line." No singer of his background could have produced such an answer. The accusation only deepened the divide. Admirers called it proof of jealousy, while skeptics clung to it as evidence of fraud. In Las Vegas, meanwhile, the very hotel that hosted the infamous press conference leaned into the publicity. They displayed posters with bold letters, "Come hear the King, the man who speaks for the people." Crowds swelled. Tickets sold faster than ever. Even those who had never listened to his records came just to see the man who had stared down the press. For Elvis himself, the noise was disorienting. He sat in his suite one evening, surrounded by stacks of papers. Some praised him, some mocked him. He flipped through them quietly, the glow of a lamp casting shadows across his tired face. When a friend asked him how he felt, he answered simply, "They'll write what they want. What matters is how folks out there hear it." He pointed toward the window, where the neon of the strip pulsed like a heartbeat. But there was a truth he could not ignore. The battle had shifted. It was no longer just about Elvis Presley, the performer. It had become about Elvis Presley, the symbol. A man from a wooden shack in Mississippi, now standing as proof that dignity and intelligence could not be measured by diplomas or accents. That duality made the press frenzy more intense. For every article that praised him, another tried to cut him down. Yet, the more they mocked, the more ordinary people rallied behind him. The press had intended to isolate him, to brand him unfit for the cultural elite. Instead, they had unwittingly bound him closer to the public. By the end of that week, Elvis's words were being quoted in places he never imagined. University newspapers debated whether rock and roll could carry intellectual weight. Radio hosts, who once dismissed him as vulgar, replayed his remarks with grudging respect. Even in churches, pastors cited his answer as an example of humility transformed into strength. It was a strange kind of fame, not born of music, not born of scandal, but of a single, unplanned moment of defiance. Elvis had not set out to change the conversation, but his refusal to be diminished had rippled outward, shaking the image that critics had worked years to cement. Still, even as the world buzzed, he remained restless. The scars of ridicule did not vanish with headlines. Alone at night, turning pages of a book or strumming softly on his guitar, he wondered if this storm was just beginning. If standing up once had caused such upheaval, what would happen the next time someone tried to cut him down in public? That question was not hypothetical. The press had tasted blood, and they were not finished. The stage had been set for an even sharper clash, one that would test not only his patience, but his very sense of self. Graceland at night had a stillness that belied the chaos outside its gates. Fans sometimes camped along the walls, hoping for a glimpse of their idol, while inside, Elvis wandered through rooms that echoed more with his thoughts than with footsteps. In the quietest hours, when the house finally fell asleep, he often retreated to his library. The room was not enormous, but it was crowded with shelves that sagged under the weight of books he had gathered over the years. More than 600 volumes, covering everything from theology to American history, from poetry to esoteric philosophy. The smell of paper and ink was sharp, mingling with the faint scent of the leather chair that had molded to his frame. Here, away from spotlights and flashbulbs, Elvis searched for something he couldn't find on stage. A sense of understanding, a grounding for the questions that never left him. One night, in the mid-1970s, he sat hunched over a heavy tome, passages underlined in pencil, notes scribbled in margins. A yellow lamp lit his face, revealing the exhaustion in his eyes. He whispered to himself as he read, testing the words aloud, as if by speaking them he might absorb their power. "Knowledge without love is nothing," he murmured, his finger following the line. Then he leaned back, staring at the ceiling. "I don't have to prove anything to them. But still, why do I want to?" The question gnawed at him. He had silenced critics with a single press conference, yet the doubt clung like smoke. Could a man without degrees, without polished diction, ever truly command respect from the world's gatekeepers? His friends noticed the changes. Gatherings with the Memphis Mafia, once filled with laughter, sometimes turned into unexpected lectures. Elvis would open a book, read a paragraph, and ask the room what they thought. At first, they chuckled, assuming he was joking. But as he continued, they realized he was serious. His tone carried a quiet urgency, as though he was searching not for their amusement, but for affirmation that he was more than a stage act. One evening, when a few of them laughed at his sudden recitation from a philosophy text, he slammed the book shut and glared. "You think I'm playing? I've got more in my head than rhinestones and songs. Don't you see? They've been calling me a fool for 20 years. I can't let that stand." The room fell silent. No one mocked again. Privately, Elvis began to fill journals with his thoughts. Lines about God, mortality, fame, and the loneliness that seeped into his bones. Some were fragments, half-sentences scribbled before sleep. Others were longer reflections, written with the intensity of a man trying to anchor himself. These notebooks were never intended for the public. They were raw, unpolished, but they revealed a man fighting for clarity, searching for his own voice beyond the noise. On stage, however, he rarely revealed this side. Fans wanted music, not philosophy. Yet occasionally, in interviews, something slipped through. Once, when asked about faith, he referenced an obscure passage from the Old Testament, drawing a puzzled look from the reporter. Another time, he spoke of history in a way that startled those who assumed he had never read beyond comic strips. Each instance chipped away at the narrative that he was incapable of thought. But the media was relentless. A popular magazine ran a feature with the headline, "Presley Pretends to be Philosopher." The article painted him as a man desperate to seem intelligent, suggesting that he kept books as props rather than for reading. The writer even claimed that any deep answer he gave in interviews must have been fed to him by publicists. The accusation cut deeply. Alone in his room, Elvis threw the magazine across the floor, the pages scattering like debris. "Pretends?" he muttered. "They don't know how many nights I've sat here with nothing but these pages." He walked to the shelf, running his hand along the spines, stopping at the Bible his mother had once read to him. He pulled it down, pressing it to his chest before opening it. The words were familiar, steadying, but the wound remained. Even among his closest circle, there were moments of misunderstanding. Some friends urged him to ignore the critics, to focus only on music. "You don't owe them nothing, E," one insisted. Elvis shook his head. "It's not about owing. It's about truth. If they keep calling me stupid, it ain't just me they're talking about. It's every poor boy that never had a chance at college. I have to show them something else." This internal tug-of-war wore on him. On the one hand, he knew he did not need validation from the elite. His music, his fans, his legacy already spoke louder than any diploma. On the other hand, the constant jabs had planted seeds of restlessness. He feared being remembered not as a thinker, not even as an artist, but as a caricature, a glittering entertainer, dismissed by history as shallow. Late one night, sitting alone with an open notebook, he wrote a single line before closing it. "They will not laugh forever." The words were both a promise and a burden. He carried them into every performance, into every interview, waiting for the next test. For if the press thought he would bow under the weight of ridicule, they were mistaken. He was building in silence a reservoir of strength that would erupt when the moment came. And that moment was already on its way. Another press conference, another familiar voice rising from the crowd, determined to drag him back down. This time, Elvis would not just defend himself. He would deliver a reply so sharp that it would cut through not only the question, but the entire narrative that had haunted him since boyhood. The months that followed were filled with tours, hotel suites, and stages that glittered under spotlights. Crowds still roared, women still reached for his hand, but Elvis carried a quiet tension behind his eyes. He knew the press had not finished with him. Every city, every show, brought another press room filled with flashing bulbs and sharpened questions. In the fall of 1972, the air in a Nashville conference hall was heavy with smoke and anticipation. Heavy with smoke and anticipation. Elvis had just finished a triumphant set, rhinestones gleaming, voice still echoing in the ears of thousands, and now he sat before a long table, water glass at his side, microphones once again clustered like bayonets. The reporters jostled for position, eager for sound bites. The first questions were tame, about his schedule, his health, his upcoming recordings. Elvis answered with the same steady politeness he always offered. Then a familiar voice broke through. It was the same journalist who had mocked him in Las Vegas. His tone carried that same oily confidence, but sharper this time, as if determined to reclaim victory. "Mr. Presley," he called out, raising his pen like a weapon, "you've proven you can sing and put on a fine show. But let's be honest, can a man without higher education truly shape history? Or are you just entertainment, here today and forgotten tomorrow?" The words cut through the room like a knife. The murmurs of reporters quieted. A few smiled, waiting for fireworks. Others looked down, embarrassed at the cruelty. Elvis sat motionless, hands folded, staring at the man who had once filled the air with laughter at his expense. He let the silence stretch. 10 seconds. 20. The clicking of cameras grew frantic. The longer he remained silent, the more the tension mounted, until it felt like the entire hall was holding its breath. Finally, he leaned forward. His voice was quiet, but carried through the room with clarity. "You ask if a man without a diploma can change history. I'll tell you something, sir. History has been written by more than scholars. Christ had no degree. Neither did the fishermen who followed him. They had love, they had truth, and the world still remembers their names." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. For a split second, the room was stunned into stillness. Then the applause began, first scattered, then swelling until even some reporters were clapping. A few stood, caught up in the unexpected wave. Cameras flashed, trying to capture not just an image, but the electricity of the moment. The journalist who had asked the question shifted in his seat, his smirk gone. His pen hovered above his notebook, but no words came. He had wanted a spectacle of humiliation. Instead, he had become the one silenced. And then came the twist no one expected. Another reporter, one known for harsh reviews of Elvis in the past, stood up. He cleared his throat, glanced at his peers, then spoke into the microphone. "I've criticized you before, Mr. Presley. But tonight, I must say, you're right." His admission sent another ripple through the room. Cameras swung toward him, capturing an unlikely moment of concession. By evening, television stations across the country replayed the clip. Anchors spoke of Elvis's remarkable composure and unshakable presence. Radio hosts debated whether he had crossed from mere celebrity into something larger. A cultural voice capable of cutting through the cynicism of the press. For Elvis, the scene was both victory and release. Backstage afterward, he leaned against the wall, sweat still beading his forehead. One of his friends slapped him on the shoulder. You owned that room." "Nobody'll forget it." Elvis only shook his head, half smiling. "I wasn't trying to own it. I just told the truth." The truth, however, had consequences. By the next morning, his words were splashed across headlines again. "Presley invokes Christ in press conference showdown." Some commentators praised him as courageous, a man unafraid to put faith above credentials. Others accused him of arrogance, of hiding behind religion to mask ignorance. The divide grew sharper, but so did his stature. The journalist who had provoked him tried to strike back, drafting a scathing editorial. But in a twist of irony, his editors cut the piece, fearing backlash from readers who had been moved by Elvis's words. The story of the encounter was no longer his to control. It belonged to the public, and they embraced it. In homes across America, families discussed the moment over dinner tables. Ministers quoted him from pulpits. College students debated whether his point about history carried merit. For the first time, intellectual circles that had once dismissed him found themselves forced to engage with him, even if begrudgingly. And yet, in the quiet of his suite that night, Elvis did not gloat. He sat by the window, looking out over the Nashville skyline, the city lights twinkling like a scattered constellation. He thought of Tupelo, of classrooms where laughter once filled the air when he tried to speak. He thought of the weight of every sneer, every headline calling him a hillbilly, and he thought of his mother, who had always told him that the Lord gave every person a gift, not of paper or status, but of heart. He whispered to himself, "Maybe that's all I needed to say." But he knew it was not over. The world had seen him stand tall a second time, and the reaction had only intensified. What began as mockery had become something larger, a cultural reckoning. The press would keep coming, eager to test him again. And Elvis, though weary, understood now that he carried more than songs. He carried the burden of proving that dignity could rise from poverty, that wisdom could bloom without diplomas. The man who once shrank in silence at a classroom desk had now silenced a hall full of journalists with nothing but conviction. And with that, the battle lines between Elvis Presley and the media were redrawn, sharper, deeper, impossible to ignore. The echoes of Elvis's second confrontation did not stop at the borders of the United States. Within days, newspapers in London, Paris, and Tokyo were running translations of his words. What had been a tense exchange in a Nashville press hall became an international story, dissected in classrooms, coffee houses, and radio stations around the globe. In Britain, the Times published a feature titled, "When the King Spoke of Christ." The article surprised readers by treating him not as a pop star, but as a cultural figure capable of shaping discourse. In Germany, where his military service still carried weight, papers praised him as the American soldier who returned home not only with medals, but with wisdom. In Japan, magazines printed his words alongside photographs of him in his white jumpsuit, framing him as a modern-day prophet of humility. The most unexpected ripple came from universities. Student newspapers began quoting his reply about Christ and history, using it as a springboard to debate the value of formal education versus lived experience. In campus common rooms, young people argued, was Elvis right to suggest that greatness could exist outside academia? Or was he romanticizing ignorance? Professors, some of whom had once mocked him, suddenly found their students pressing them for answers. At Yale, a philosophy professor was asked during a lecture what he thought of Presley's words. Caught off guard, he paused before admitting, "It is not the place of education to dismiss those without it." Sometimes the clarity of experience can illuminate more than years of study. His remark drew murmurs. And for the first time, Elvis's name was being spoken in ivy-covered halls as more than a punchline. Meanwhile, fan mail poured into Graceland in staggering numbers. Thousands of young men and women wrote that his defiance gave them courage. "I dropped out to work the fields with my father," one wrote from Kansas. "When they call me dumb, I'll remember your words." Another, from a struggling single mother in New York, confessed, "I never finished school. You reminded me my life still has meaning." The story gained a life of its own. Radio stations replayed clips from the conference, intercut with his songs, as if his words were lyrics set to music. Television hosts debated whether Presley had become more than a performer, whether he had stepped into the role of spokesman for a class of people often ignored. And then came an invitation no one expected. A prestigious university in the Midwest, extended an offer for Elvis to deliver a public lecture on music and American culture. The letter, written in formal language, praised him for giving voice to those excluded from scholarly circles. When Elvis read it, he chuckled, shaking his head. Me? Give a lecture? Lord, they'd laugh me off the stage. Yet the sincerity of the offer was undeniable. After much thought, he agreed to attend, but on one condition, that any honorarium be directed to scholarships for students from poor families. His generosity startled administrators, but it revealed the sincerity behind his struggle. Elvis was not looking for validation. He was looking to open doors for others who, like him, had been dismissed for lacking credentials. The day of the lecture arrived, and the auditorium filled with professors, students, and reporters eager to witness the unlikely event. Elvis walked onto the stage, not in rhinestones, but in a simple suit. He spoke not as a performer, but as a man reflecting on his journey, from Tupelo's dirt streets to the world's biggest stages. He told stories of his mother's sacrifices, of learning from gospel singers, of reading late into the night when the world thought he was shallow. He reminded them that music itself was born from ordinary people, not scholars, and that culture was shaped as much by the fields and churches of the South as by ivory towers. The room sat in rapt attention. Some students cried quietly. Professors, arms folded at first, gradually leaned forward, compelled despite themselves. When he finished, there was no hesitation. The hall erupted into a standing ovation. Reporters rushed to frame it. Presley delivers lecture like no other. A European correspondent called it the moment the king became a statesman of culture. The skeptics still scoffed, accusing him of pandering, but the tide had clearly shifted. Elvis had crossed into territory no one thought possible. What struck those present most was not the eloquence of his speech, but the humility behind it. He ended not with triumph, but with a reminder. I'm no scholar, ladies and gentlemen. I'm just a man who loves people and who learned from life. If that counts for something, I'm grateful. If not, I'll keep singing anyway. Those words crystallized the paradox of Elvis Presley. A superstar burdened by the simplest of doubts, yet rising to meet them with grace. Afterward, he refused interviews. He left the campus quietly, his car slipping away while students lingered, buzzing about what they had just witnessed. He asked for no recognition, no spotlight. But the impact lingered, growing in strength with every retelling. What began as ridicule had now turned into something larger than even Elvis could fully grasp. A global conversation about class, knowledge, and the measure of a man. The press had tried to reduce him to a symbol of ignorance. Instead, he had become a mirror in which millions saw their own worth reflected. Still, the whirlwind left him weary. Back at Graceland, surrounded by letters and clippings, he often retreated once more to his quiet rooms. He knew the world's attention was fickle. Applause could vanish as quickly as it came. Yet he also knew something had shifted forever. The boy mocked for his accent was now being quoted in lecture halls across continents. And as the sun set over Memphis one evening, he whispered to himself, almost in disbelief, "Maybe I gave them more than a song." The summer of 1975 pressed heavy over Memphis, the kind of heat that slowed even the cicadas. Inside Graceland, the great house stood in contrast to the noise of the city outside its gates. Tourists and fans sometimes gathered near the iron fence, leaving flowers or letters. But the night belonged to Elvis alone. He sat in his study, the one room where he allowed the world to fall away. Books covered the desk in untidy stacks, the Bible worn from use, volumes on American history, a collection of spiritual writings with passages underlined in pencil. A single lamp illuminated the papers, leaving the corners of the room in shadow. On the desk lay a pile of unopened envelopes, many addressed in uncertain handwriting. He opened a few. One was from a college student who confessed she came from a family of sharecroppers. She wrote that his words about education had kept her from giving up. Another letter, from a factory worker in Pennsylvania, said simply, "You made me proud to be ordinary." Elvis read slowly, his finger tracing the lines. Then he placed the letters back on the desk and reached for his Bible. He opened it at random, landing on a passage from the Gospel of Luke. "For he that is least among you all, the same shall be great." He whispered it aloud, almost to himself, and let the words settle in the quiet. The verse pulled him backward in memory. He saw himself as a boy in Tupelo, standing barefoot in a patched shirt, clutching his mother's hand. He remembered the shame of classmates laughing at his accent, the sting of being too poor to fit in. He thought of the first time a teacher had asked him to sing, and the silence that followed his trembling voice. Now, decades later, that boy seemed both impossibly distant and yet always present, a shadow he could never fully outrun. A faint smile touched his lips. "If they'd told that little boy he'd be here someday," he murmured, "he'd have thought it was a joke." On the far side of the desk lay a notebook, its leather cover creased. He opened it and began to write. His handwriting was uneven, letters leaning one way then another, but the words carried weight. Reflections on the passage he had just read, on how greatness was never about diplomas or applause, but about love, humility, and faith. These thoughts were not for interviews, not for reporters, but for himself, a record of the man beneath the glitter. A knock interrupted the silence. One of his close friends poked his head in, asking if he wanted company. Elvis shook his head gently. "Not tonight. I just need some quiet." The friend nodded and left him alone. After a while, Elvis pushed the notebook aside and picked up the phone. He dialed slowly, hesitating before pressing the final number. The call rang 3 times before a voice answered, frail, older now, but unmistakable. It was his former history teacher from Hume's High. "Mr. Presley?" the man asked, startled. "Yes, sir." "It's Elvis," he said softly. "I just wanted to thank you. You might not remember, but you never laughed at me in class. You treated me with respect when others didn't. I've carried that with me all these years." There was silence on the line, then a sound of muffled emotion. The teacher's voice trembled. "Elvis, I always knew you had more in you than people saw. I'm proud of you." The words struck him deeper than any standing ovation. For a moment, Elvis could not speak. He closed his eyes, letting the weight of the praise settle into the cracks of doubt that still haunted him. When he finally hung up, he sat in stillness, the hum of the air conditioner the only sound. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling, tears gathering but never falling. That night, the mansion around him felt both vast and lonely. Fame had given him riches, adoration, and power. But in the end, what mattered most were simple words from an old teacher, a reminder that he had been seen not as a caricature, but as a human being. Before heading to bed, he wrote one last line in his notebook. "The world can doubt me, but God knows my heart." That's enough. He closed the cover, set it gently on the desk, and switched off the lamp. The study fell into darkness, but the feeling lingered, a fragile peace that came not from applause, but from the quiet assurance that even in the eyes of those who once knew him as a boy, he had become something greater than he ever believed possible. It was a peace he would cling to, unaware that time was running shorter than he realized, and that soon the world would hear his final words on the subject that had haunted him all his life. The summer of 1977 carried with it a sense of unease. Elvis was still performing, still adored, but the weight of years, the tours, the strain, the endless scrutiny had settled heavily on him. Behind the rhinestones and stage lights was a man tired in ways few could see. Yet even in those last months, the press had not left him alone. One afternoon, in the privacy of Graceland, he agreed to a rare interview with a national magazine. The journalist, younger than most, came prepared with questions that pressed on familiar wounds. They talked about music, about touring, about the changing sound of America. Then, with a tilt of the head and a half-smile, the reporter asked the question that had shadowed Elvis for decades. "Do you ever regret not having more formal education? Do you wish you had gone further than high school?" The room fell quiet. Elvis leaned back, the weight of the question pressing against him once again. He had heard it before, in sneers and in jokes, but this time he was not on a stage or at a press table. It was private, almost intimate. He considered the reporter for a long moment, his eyes steady. Finally, he spoke. His voice was gentle, but each word carried a gravity sharpened by years of reflection. Knowledge isn't just what you learn in a classroom. A diploma's a piece of paper. What matters is what's in your heart. If you know how to love people, if you can make them feel they matter, that's the greatest knowledge of all. The reporter, who had been ready with follow-up questions, faltered. The pen hovered above his notepad, unmoving. For once, there was no laughter, no attempt at mockery. He simply nodded, struck silent by the sincerity in the answer. That interview was published just weeks before Elvis's death. The quote was small in the article, tucked between discussions of his health and his career, but after the news of his passing, it took on a life of its own. Those words, "If you know how to love people, that's the greatest knowledge of all," spread across newspapers, radio broadcasts, and television screens. Something shifted in the tone of the press. Even the harshest critics, who had once mocked his accent and his lack of degrees, found themselves repeating the line. College students painted it on banners in dorm rooms. Church bulletins printed it alongside scripture. In small towns, people taped the words to cafe walls and union boards. It was as if the world realized too late that the man they had belittled had left behind a truth that outlived ridicule. Most striking of all was the reaction of the very journalist who had once mocked him publicly at those press conferences. In the days following Elvis's death, he wrote a column unlike any he had ever penned. "I laughed at him," the piece began. "I doubted him. I dismissed him. But when I look back, I see a man who understood more about love and dignity than any of us who called ourselves educated. He knew what mattered, and I did not." The admission stunned readers. Coming from a voice that had once led the chorus of derision, it was a confession that sealed Elvis's words in history. Graceland, meanwhile, became a pilgrimage site. Visitors left not just flowers and records, but handwritten notes quoting his final interview. Some wrote their own stories of struggle. Farmers, waitresses, veterans, students who had never finished school. They saw in his words a validation of their lives, proof that worth could not be measured in diplomas or pedigree. In the years that followed, Elvis's quote appeared on posters, in yearbooks, on the walls of classrooms. It traveled far beyond music, taking on a universal quality. The boy who once trembled in a Memphis classroom, mocked for his accent, had left behind a legacy not of degrees, but of wisdom spoken in plain words. For those who loved him, the irony was profound. The very subject that had once been the sharpest weapon against him, his lack of education, became the source of his most enduring lesson. The world would not remember the jeers or the headlines that called him ignorant. It would remember the quiet strength of a man who believed that love itself was the highest form of knowledge. On the final page of one of his private notebooks, found after his passing, a single line was scrawled, "Love is the lesson." Whether he meant it for himself or for others, no one could say. But it captured everything he had tried to live, and everything he had left behind. And so, in the end, the boy from Tupelo who once stood barefoot in poverty, the man who faced decades of ridicule from polished voices in newsrooms, closed his story with a truth the world could not ignore. That greatness is not found in titles or certificates, but in the ability to see the humanity in others and to love them without measure. That was his last word, and it became his legend.